Thank you, Peter. My name is Cindy. I'm a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. I'd like to thank the committee for inviting me. I need to point out whose fault it is that I'm leaving right after I talk. I try never to accept any more responsibility than I absolutely have to. And when Dick called and asked me to come, he asked me to be the Friday night speaker. So being a typical obsessive-compulsive, I arranged for something to be going on this afternoon when I get home, back to Tucson. So I arranged to catch an 11:45 flight. And, you know, the more I do this, the more slick I think I'm getting at figuring it all out. And so when Dick met me at the plane, and I said, now I talk tonight, right? He said, no, you talk Sunday morning at 10. I said, I can't. I got to catch an 11 o'clock plane. That's why you're here at 9:30. That's why I'm here at 9:30. I've always wanted to have the opportunity to duck out the door after I talk. And I have always gotten exactly what I prayed for. Almost never in the way I expected it, but I always get it. And I'll tell you a lot about that this morning. It's been a wonderful weekend for me. It was a beautiful meeting last night. I love Winnie and I love Jim, and I especially want to thank that dear drunken Dennis and what's-her-name for making those stories possible. It reminds me to be grateful for the SOBs who got me here this morning. I have a lot of them in my life, in my experience, and a part of my experience in AA has been to learn to love all of them. That process began when you loved me at a time when I couldn't love myself. When I got to Alcoholics Anonymous, there was not very much left. But the beautiful thing about you all is that you don't need to have very much left. There doesn't need to be much of us for you to get hold and say, hang in there. Just don't drink and it'll get better. Now, I happen to hear things in a strange way. So when you said to me, if you don't drink, it'll get better, I heard you say, it'll never be bad again. And when you said, if you stick around, it'll get better, I had no idea you meant everything would get better. I would have better joy and better pain, better laughter, better sorrow. I was absolutely panic-stricken for the first year or so that I was around AA, that I had lost the ability to care. It didn't seem to me like I would ever really give a damn again. There's a wonderful story that describes beautifully what I was like about a city man who wanted a horse. And he went to the farmer and said, I need a horse. And the farmer said, I got just the one. And they went down to the pasture, and the farmer whistled, and his horse came running up out of the pasture and ran right into the side of the barn and fell down. The city man said, could I see that again? And the farmer said, sure, and he whistled, and the horse got up and ran across the pasture and ran into the windmill and fell down. And the city man said, is that horse blind? The farmer said, no, man, he just doesn't give a damn. That's pretty much a story of what it used to be like for me. I got up a lot, I ran real hard, and I fell down a lot. Ran into a lot of things along the way. I grew up in a beautiful home in the Midwest, full of love and laughter and sunshine, and went off to college in 1959 as a freshman at Kansas University, and promptly learned about fear, terror, anger, a whole lot of things that I was not well prepared to experience. Those of you who have survived the 60s, and I assume there are a few of us here, remember that in the early 60s, everybody was angry about something. And being the kind of person I am, I assumed it was my fault, that I had done something somewhere along the way to make everybody so angry. Some professionals believe that alcoholics are more sensitive than others. I don't. I happen to believe that we just take our sensitivity much too seriously. I, as a matter of fact, believe that I also suffer from the disease of seriousness. I do believe it's a disease for me, and if I'm not very careful today, I get much too serious. And when I lose my ability to laugh, I begin to lose my ability to live comfortably in my life today. Fortunately, because of you, my life today is full of laughter. But when you found me, it wasn't. I got married when I was 19 because college was too much for me. And to escape the fear, I did what many young women do. I decided to make my life nice and comfortable and predictable and get married. I married a member of the Wichita, Kansas jet set. And when I say that in California, everybody laughs. The more I get into the Midwest, the less people laugh at that. It's interesting. I must be in the Midwest. But he was about 10 years older than I was, and he had among his higher priorities to teach me to drink. Because it was very much a part of our lives. We raced sailboats and snow skied and drank. And our life was full of cocktail parties, and he used to say, I don't know what happens. You get all dressed up, you look wonderful, we go out, we have a little dinner, I turn around, and you're struck drunk. And that's exactly what alcohol did to me. I got struck drunk. I still don't understand it. Today I realize I don't have to understand it. I don't understand most things. In fact, I'm increasingly struck by the number of things I know nothing about. But our marriage lasted for about 6 years, and as a part of that marriage, I had our son. And a measure of my growth is my ability to say our son today. He was my son for many years until he got in trouble, and then he was his son. But by 1970, my life had collapsed totally as a result of my experience with alcohol and drugs. I was at that point a mother, a teacher, a student. I was working on my master's degree in psychology at Wichita State University. And all of a sudden, out of the clear blue, it seemed to me, I was hospitalized with serum hepatitis and chronic heroin addiction. Now, you don't go from 19-year-old learning how to drink to a drunken junkie overnight. A lot of things happened. A lot of people came into my life. In about 1967, a man came into my life and said, honey, you're a lush, I have an instant cure, and he mainlined me with morphine. And I didn't drink very much for the next few years. I only drank when I was with my alcoholic friends, and I shot dope when I was with my junkie friends. If you've ever tried to keep those two worlds separate, you know, nobody hates a junkie more than a drunk, and nobody hates a drunk more than a junkie. You've got to have somebody who's a little lower, and keeping those two worlds separate kept me very busy. So I worked very hard in those days. It's really hard to get it together and keep it together when you don't even have it. When whatever it is lives in a bottle or a syringe, and when you can't even manage to move in the morning without grabbing it first and pouring it in or shooting it in, or somehow getting it in so that you can go about your day. I look back on that period of my life and wonder how I worked so hard. My life is so easy today. I very simply, every morning, take the 11th step, as I was taught. I get up, I report for duty, I ask for a little guidance and direction. I go about God's business, and He takes care of mine. Woody Allen says that 80% of life is just showing up. And that's my experience. I just show up. I just do what's in front of me, and sometimes I get very confused about what is right in front of me. But it's nothing like it was in those days. As a result of being hospitalized, I promptly was excused from the university. Professor came to my hospital room and said, honey, we put your experimental rats to sleep. We'd like for you to very quietly leave town. A lawyer came to my home after I got out of the hospital and said, we have come to inform you that you have lost the right to raise your son. The state of Kansas believes you're an unfit mother, and we suggest you get out of town. I did what I had done for many years of my life. I went home to my mom and dad. They're a very important part of my life and my story because they always took me back. And for many years of my life, I went back regularly. After the last divorce or the last hospitalization, my mother bailed me out of hospital after hospital. But that summer in 1970, when she came to the hospital and found out why I was there, she looked at me and she said, "Honey, I cannot do it anymore. I cannot help you again. I can't bail you out one more time." But she did. So I went home with Mother and Dad sat me down on the couch and he said, "Honey, you've had a rough time. Let's have a martini." My father, as several people have said this weekend, is my favorite drunk. He always has been. He always will be. He, from a very early age, was to me the most fascinating, exciting, interesting person in the world. And I've had occasion to talk to my sister, who's about 18 months younger than I, since I've been sober, to find out that she and I had a totally different childhood. We were raised in the same home by the same parents. I thought, for years, saw the same things. Not true. She experienced my father as a drunk when we were in high school. I didn't know till I was 30 years old that my dad even drank too much. I knew he drank a lot, but then how much is too much? She was afraid of him. I was always in awe of him, fascinated by what he did and wanted to do it. I look back on those years and wonder how we could have had such totally different experiences. But my sister was born spiritual and I was born an alcoholic, and that's the major difference. She began talking with God at a very early age, and I missed that somehow. We just grew up in different homes together. So I went home with Mother and Dad, and they nursed me back to health, so to speak, of what passed for health in those days. And I did what many self-respecting addicts do. I finally got a job with a veterinarian. And that, by the way, was after a job I'd had for a chemical company in Kansas City. And this is such a small world. One of the men who worked in that chemical company is also, for those of you who have heard Bob E., a man that Bob calls Charlie Snowshoes. And he now lives, I guess, or did live in Denver. I do not remember his name, but I do remember that I worked for him, got fired from that job for getting drunk with the chemist, because the chemist put an amazing concoction in the Coke bottles and shared it with me. And I remember that man's office because it was one of the only peaceful places in that company. And when I found out a few years ago that that man and that quiet office were the same as Bob E.'s Charlie Snowshoes, I thought, I wonder what I have to do with anything. I wonder if my conscious effort means a damn thing. There seem to be forces going on that bring about experiences and events in my life exactly when I need them. And by January of 1972, I had spent a couple of years drinking. In 1970, they told me that if I didn't quit using drugs and drinking, I would not see my 30th birthday. As a result of the miracle of Alcoholics Anonymous, I was 40 in February. I consider that a major milestone. Every day since 30 has been a gift. It has been just gravy because I wasn't supposed to make it. And in many ways, I didn't. Because the me that was in 1970 is not anymore. She died because to live she had to drink. And when I got sober, she began to die. And today, the part of me that lives, I was diagnosed, by the way, along about 19 69, is a paranoid schizophrenic. Now, alcoholism looks a lot like paranoid schizophrenia, but I also happen to be a paranoid schizophrenic. We do it much better in Alcoholics Anonymous. You all have taught me how to be a paranoid schizophrenic with grace and dignity. You've taught me the difference between negative paranoia and positive paranoia. I suffered for many years from negative paranoia. I believed that the world was a conspiracy organized against me, and that everything, no matter what, would fall apart. And of course, since I believed it, it had to happen. Now, in sobriety, I have learned about positive paranoia. I today believe that the world is a conspiracy organized for my benefit, and it will get my attention. Sometimes it tries to get my attention subtly, and sometimes I'm not paying attention. So it gets real tough. But it is a conspiracy organized for my benefit. I'm also very schizophrenic. There are at least 4 or 5 of me up here. The one that's talking right now, and I just felt her wake up, is right here. The one that was talking a little bit earlier is up here, and she's very nervous, and she's very worried about what she's going to say and how you all are going to experience it, and if she says the right thing. And she takes a lot of credit and worries about the results. And she lives in my head, and she's still doing quite well. But the one that lives down here is getting better every day. You see, she's very mellow, very quiet. She knows that everything is absolutely perfect. She knows that I am the perfect person for the situation I find myself in, always. Now, it's fine for me to say I'm the perfect person for the situation I find myself in when I'm standing up here doing God's business. It's another thing to remember that I'm the perfect person for the situation I find myself in when I'm having a period of growth in Alcoholics Anonymous. I sometimes think that anybody should get better faster than I have. Anybody could do it quicker. But then I think, well, on the other hand, maybe it's a good thing I'm going so slowly, because I might be going the wrong direction. So everything has within it its opposite. You know, if you think about something long enough, you'll realize that carried to its extreme, it'll turn into its opposite. For example, drinking turned me into Alcoholics Anonymous. Most of my experiences have proven to me that every ending has within it a new beginning. And of course, every beginning has within it some kind of ending. Now, when I'm in an ending, it's very hard for me to remember to look for the beginning, because I take my endings very hard in most cases. A friend of mine asked me how I handle trouble in sobriety. Very poorly. I fall apart, I cry, I beg for help, forgetting that I don't have to beg for anything. Chuck says God can't give you anything. He's already given you everything. Open up to it. Let it come in. But those several people that live within me argue a lot about what's good for us. They have endless discussions. Jim said it beautifully, meetings. We have meetings. We had one half an hour ago in the bathroom. And our meetings can go on for hours and hours, and like many meetings that I go to professionally, nothing gets resolved. That's why it's so important for me to remember just to show up, just to do it one day at a time, and know that since I have prayed on a daily basis for guidance and direction, that is exactly what I have. I really worked portions of the 11th step for a long time in sobriety. I prayed for guidance and direction and then wondered when I'd get it. Today I pray for guidance and direction and know that I have it now. I am the creator of my life. I have created every experience I've ever had. One of the ways I create my experiences is with judgment. It is one of those challenges that I meet daily, almost. And I have learned a lot about judging others. I have learned that when I judge another, I create the necessity in my life for that experience. because God, as He works through me, when I say, my God, how could she? How could she do that? My God in here says, we'll see. We're going to find out how she does that. Here you go, into your new experience. And then I find out how she did that, because I have exactly the same experience. In January of 1972, since I've already prepared the way for being a paranoid schizophrenic, you won't mind if I jump around a bit, back and forth. My sobriety has been continuous for the last 8 years, but nothing else has. So I will jump around a lot, and I'd like to go back for a minute to January of 1972, because that's the first miracle that I remember, that I am consciously aware of. I know today that miracles have happened in my life since I was born, but I was only made aware and conscious of them in January of 1972, because at that point I had lost everything. I had lost the opportunity to do all of the things I'd ever hoped to do. I could not go back to school. I could not raise my only son. I could not live comfortably in my world, in my body, in my head. I had experienced humiliation and degradation that only a woman who is a drunken junkie can experience. I had sold my soul, my body, my mind for drugs. And I was working for a veterinarian in Kansas City, Missouri. And one Friday afternoon he said, honey, the last few days have been the last few days. I can't handle you anymore. I had been stealing his morphine regularly. And of course, as usual, the morphine kept me so loaded I had no idea that he might be suspecting me, because I had a very slick trick. I would replace the morphine I took with sterile water. And he began to notice that the dogs were screaming and nothing bothered me. So he informed me that he could not afford my services any longer, and if I didn't do something about my condition, he'd have to let me go. So he left the clinic, and I took a bottle of Demerol from the drawer and locked up the clinic and went home and spent that night drinking scotch and shooting Demerol. And I did not go to sleep. I did not pass out. I did not throw up. I just sat in my agony, my misery, my despair. Somehow, I mean, that can't work that way. You realize that. You cannot pump scotch and Demerol into your body and have nothing happen. Those are powerful, potent drugs. But that night, nothing happened. I couldn't go to sleep. I couldn't stay awake. I couldn't stand my life. I couldn't get out of my life. Early that morning, I took a bath and had a couple of Bloody Marys and decided to try to eat, because it was, after all, the day when I had to do something. I had no idea what to do. I didn't know what was wrong with me. So how could I have known what in the world to do? So I decided to eat breakfast. Eating was not something I was good at when I was using drugs and alcohol. You wouldn't stay down. I sprayed, like Tim said, everywhere, everything. I was a puking drunk from the day I drank. And so I decided I'd try to eat. And I went to a restaurant in Kansas City that I never went to. It was safer that way. And I walked into the restaurant, and it's a big restaurant. And there was one seat available at the counter. So I sat down. I realized today that that was my seat in Alcoholics Anonymous. You had saved it for me, and I know today you would have saved it a lot longer. But that day, God, as I understand God, who works within me, knew we were all ready. We'd had enough. We'd fought long enough. So I sat down and ordered some breakfast and tried to eat, and gagged and choked as quietly as possible. And the man sitting next to me seemed to notice that I was uncomfortable. And when I finally gave up and concentrated on my coffee and getting a cigarette lit, he began a conversation. And I had a very narrow focus in those days. I had to do what I was doing. I couldn't notice anything else or I'd forget what I was doing, and sometimes it was disastrous, especially if I was driving a car. But he began a conversation. For the first time I looked at him, and he was magnificent. He was a very handsome man. He had on a clean white shirt and a tie. He had on a well-trimmed beard. He had beautiful, clear blue eyes. And I thought, oh, isn't he lovely? And he looked at me and he said, it looks like you've had a rough night. I said, well, no. He said, I understand. And I looked at him again, and he was still out on the white shirt, and he still had the blue eyes. I said, you what? He said, I understand. I'm an alcoholic. And I said, well, I'm not. I'm a junkie. He said, I'm a junkie. He said, you smell funny. And I said, I drink to stay off drugs. And he said, does it work? And I said, no. And he said, why don't you come with me? I have some friends who might be able to help you. I didn't have a lot to do that day. It was a day when I had to do something. And I don't know about you, but by that time in my life, I spent a lot of time on what you call the hustle. Trying to find people who were open, vulnerable, easy marks. And here, sitting right next to me, was obviously an easy mark. I knew that he could get me a drink, and that he would. So he took me to a friend's house, and the two of them spent the day talking with me. And David, the guy I sat down next to in the restaurant, went home. And Bill, the guy he brought me to, who was even handsomer than David, even taller, even bluer eyes. God, this program really works. Bill continued to talk to me, and after about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, this is from 9 a.m. to 4 in the afternoon, about 4 or 4:30, I began to go into withdrawal. And I began to tremble, and I began to shake, and I had begun to get the idea that these guys might not be going to buy me a drink. As a matter of fact, if you're new, and if you have recently sat down next to a stranger in a restaurant and hustled that stranger for a drink and end up in a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous, you had it. Your days are numbered. You're just about done in. And I was just about done in. And I began to go into withdrawal, and Bill began to comfort me, and one thing led to another, and we went to bed, and then we went to my first meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. So I am what some people call the 13th-step girl. As I understand God today, who works within me, He knew exactly what it would take to get me here. He makes absolutely no mistakes for any of us at any time. I do not believe, based on my personal experience, that there is any wrong way to come to Alcoholics Anonymous. There's just getting here. And God knew that if I was ever going to pay attention, it was going to have to come through a tall, handsome man. Because that's how I've lived my life since I fell in love with my father. And I continue to live my life that way. Nothing will work today as quick as a tall, handsome man. Some things never change. I'm very grateful for that today. It's like my paranoid schizophrenia. Today I use it positively. I use it for growth. So, Bill took me to that first meeting, and on the way he said, I want you to know it doesn't work this way. I don't want you to tell anybody how it worked. Because, you see, he didn't have any more to do with it than I did. The Spirit moved him just the way it moved me. And when it was over, he said, oh, my God, And God within him said, sure. Because, see, God doesn't judge how we do it. We do that. He doesn't have to. We do fine. We take all the job of judging. He doesn't have to. God, as I understand, God is love. If that God is love, it can't be anything else. It can be only love. God, as I understand, God cannot hate or judge or take vengeance. Because if God is love, none of those are a part of love. I create my life today and every day. It is exactly as I expect it to be. It always has been. It always will be. And God knew what I needed that day. He knew what it would take to bring me to Alcoholics Anonymous, and He provided it. And He has continued to provide it. That was in Kansas City in January of 1972, and I began to try to stay sober. It was not easy, because I did not make it easy. Because I believe that you all had found me just about 20 minutes too late. That I had gone just a little bit too far. That I had just a little bit too much brain damage. That I had lost just a little bit too much of my ability to love. I knew you all cared, and I knew I couldn't. I knew when you looked at me that you were looking at something that I had lost. You knew it was still there. I didn't. You had to look at it for a long time before I began to feel it. And that's one of the many miracles of Alcoholics Anonymous. You all just keep looking at it. I look at it today. I look at it in the people who come into my life. And they are full of despair, anguish, grief, loss. But I can see it. I can see right through all that surface pain into that light. It's always there. There's always just enough left. That's why we get here. Because we got just enough left. And if you sit here today and think maybe not me, just realize that many of us sat in that same chair and thought those same thoughts. And when you decide that you really want to know about surrender, come up here for a while. Do this a few times. Because this is the most perfect exercise I know in total surrender. Because you see, I can't do this. I don't know how. I don't know what to say to you. I don't know how to tell you about the miracle of my life today. So I don't do it. I just show up. I just report for duty. And whatever happens, happens through me. Because all I know how to do is report for duty. So, I had, in my first 4 months of sobriety, 4 sponsors, all men. I heard right away, Alcoholics Anonymous is a fellowship of men and women. And when you suggested I go to a woman's tag, I said, you got to be kidding. This is a fellowship of men and women. I have very little in common with women. They have never understood me. I have never understood them, and I don't plan to start now. Men understand. And I, of course, understand men. And so I worked the program the way I could, to the very best of my ability. And I drank periodically. And some friends of mine invited me to go off to upstate New York to an AA conference, and I said, sure, and we took off. And at that conference, I met a man named Tom and fell in love. Now, I understand today why they call it falling in love. You must have noticed by now that when I fall in love, I literally fall in love. Sometimes I fall out almost as quickly, but I literally go head over heels. And that's not different today, I will tell you in a minute. It's still happening. But I fell in love with a beautiful man who happened to be the main speaker at that conference, and those of you who've fallen in love with main speakers understand. And after he talked, my friend from Kansas City introduced us, and he looked at me and he said, haven't we met before? I was much too cool at that point. See, I stayed cool for quite a while after I got to Alcoholics Anonymous. In fact, what you see is what's left of a cool chick. and there isn't much. But I was still very cool, and I sort of shrugged my shoulders, and he said, it really seems like we know each other. And it did. It really did. And Tommy and I began a journey together that day that lasted for 5 years in Alcoholics Anonymous. He came to Kansas City shortly after we met. He had to undo some situations in which he was living. I didn't have to undo any. I was a newcomer. It has been my great good fortune and the grace of God to find among the members of Alcoholics Anonymous attraction rather than promotion in the shape of tall, handsome men who believe in this way of life, who believe in carrying the message, and who believe in trying to love people back into loving themselves. And they have often, in sobriety, lost control along with me. That's why I'm here today. Because of a step that we don't talk about very much. Because of a process that we don't honor very often. God, as I understand God, is pure love. He does not judge my sex life any more than he judges my spiritual life. He leaves that to me. And I judge it just fine. I find it too much or too little, too soon or too late, whatever it is. I'm learning slowly to lighten up on myself, to deal with my disease of seriousness through laughter. Tommy and I left Kansas City in January of 1972. January of 1973, 1 year after I came into Alcoholics Anonymous. I came in January of 72. We left Kansas City in January of 73. I still had 90 days of sobriety. You all kept saying, try it for 90 days. I'd try it for 90 days and drink. Because it seemed to me that no matter what I did in the fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous, it didn't work. Because I had it backwards. Because I thought someday I was going to understand the steps and then I'd work them. I know better today. I know today that I work the steps, and sometimes I then come to understand. Sometimes I don't understand. There are some things that have happened in my sober experience that I will never understand, and I don't have to today as much as I used to. Tommy and I wandered around for a while and ended up in Laguna Beach, California. The next 4 years were magnificent years for me. God also knew that I needed a beautiful introduction to this program. And we got married finally after we'd lived together for a while and decided it wasn't just a flash in the pan. We were married in Laguna Beach. It's really remarkable how things work. Tommy had lived in Laguna before and was returning home. And he said, I don't know what we'll do when we get there, but I'll just pick up the phone and call some friends. So when we got there, he picked up the phone and he called Bob. And Bob said, Tommy, is that you? Tommy said, yes. Bob said, we need you. He said, my wife Taylor is dying of cancer. We need your help. So Tommy and I went to Bob and Taylor's home. And it was my first experience of watching members of Alcoholics Anonymous experience great loss, great pain, great tragedy, sober. I didn't know you could do that. I thought maybe you all always drank when it got tough. You just came back. Because I judged you by what I'd had to do. And previous to that point in my experience, when it got tough, I drank. Because I didn't know how not to. You were trying to teach me, but I couldn't hear for a long time. I could only hear what I thought you were saying. It took a while for me to hear what you really said to me. So Tom and I went and lived with Bob and Taylor through the course of her illness. And In April of 1973, Bob took Taylor to the hospital, and he called that evening and he said, Taylor is going. The doctors do not believe she'll last the night. And I said, I'll stay right here by the phone. Taylor was a magnificent woman, and when Taylor and I first met, she took one look at me and she said, honey, I'm going to take you to a woman's stag. Now, I'd heard that a lot. And I said, no, my dear, I don't believe in that. And she laughed and she said, I understand. I will take you to a women's meeting on Monday night in Laguna Beach. She got sick very rapidly, and she told me on several occasions that that was her choice. She chose to go rapidly, and she did. And on that Monday evening, Bob called, and I said, I'll be by the phone. And he said, no, Cindy. He said, you go to that Monday night women's meeting. You go for me, and you go for you, and you go for Taylor. Because I had just had what turned out to be my last slip. I was living with 3 members of Alcoholics Anonymous, and I found myself down in the bathroom shooting Taylor's Valium because I couldn't stand watching her die. I did not understand at that point in my life that Taylor's decision was as perfect as mine, and she had decided to go, and I couldn't watch her. So I had had a slip in the midst of Alcoholics Anonymous, and I believed thoroughly that day that nothing could help me. If you can slip, going to meetings every day, working with newcomers, and living with 3 members of AA, how can anything help? Bob said, Cindy, you go to that meeting, and you go for me, and you go for you, and you go for Taylor. I went to the Monday night meeting in Laguna Beach. As I look back on that experience today, I realize that Taylor passed on her sobriety to me because she died that night while I was in that meeting, and it has not been necessary for me to take a drink since. She knew the true dignity and grace of Alcoholics Anonymous, and she shared it with me. And I today share it with you because Taylor lives through me. Men brought me to Alcoholics Anonymous. The women have kept me here. The women in that meeting that night beat any experience I have ever had before or since. Because the women's meetings I had tried to go to in Kansas City were composed of women very different than I. And I was aware of that immediately. I knew they were different, and I knew they couldn't help. But that meeting in Laguna Beach, California, that Monday night, was full of the damnedest broads you ever saw. They made me look like a teenage hiker. Jeez, I thought I had a bad trip. I sat there in absolute awe at the remarkable dignity and grace with which those women told of humiliation and degradation. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe that women had hurt in the ways that I hurt, and they sat there, sober, and talked about it. That's what it took. I was again ready. I was ready for that meeting, that night, in that place, and boy, I got it. I got it clear down to my toes, all the way into and through me. You finally touched the part of me that was trying so hard to live. You finally reached inside of me and said, oh yes you can. If I can do it, you can do it. Since that day, I've had some astounding experiences in Alcoholics Anonymous. I began to stay sober one day at a time, without pills, without marijuana, without alcohol, in spite of my belief that I could not. Like somebody said, you don't have to believe you can do it. You just do it. I believed I couldn't. You believed I could. Your belief was stronger than mine. Because you see, I'm sure today that within me, in spite of that part of me that thought I couldn't, there was a part of me that knew all along I could. That's the part of me that got me here. That part that has survived everything I've thrown at it, dumped on it, poured into it, that part of me has survived. And that part of me has always known about Alcoholics Anonymous. Reminds me of a wonderful story about a believer and a non-believer who were discussing God or non-God. And the non-believer said, okay, you believe in your God. If he's so strong, can he create a tree this minute? The believer said, sure. As a matter of fact, the tree you want him to create already exists. It's just going to take you a long time to be able to see it. Alcoholics Anonymous. What you are, what we have in these rooms, what we do together, has always existed inside of me. It just took me a long time to get to it. And Tommy and I had a wonderful life. We laughed and played in Laguna Beach, and we worked with lots of people. We went to lots of meetings. We traveled a lot. We had a beautiful time together. After 3 years of sobriety, decided to try to get back into the university. I knew, of course, I couldn't. I always know I can't. But you've taught me to try anyway. So I tried anyway. I applied to the University of California, Irvine, and Tommy and I went off on a trip. And when we came back, not only had I been admitted, but I had been awarded a teaching assistantship. So they were going to pay me to come back to school. That can't happen, but it did. Things that can't happen happen every day in my life. I just noticed them more often. So I went back to the university. I completed my PhD in 2 years. So, if you think back a minute, I started as a freshman at Kansas University in 1959. I graduated from the University of California in 1977. It took me 18 years to get a degree. Some people are awed by that and amazed that anyone could stick it out through college for 18 years. Please believe me when I tell you that going to college is one of the few things I know how to do. I did not do it because I'm noble or strong, or I did it because I do it well, and there aren't a lot of those things. But if you'll give me a book and tell me what to read and a little bit how to think about it, I'll be eternally grateful. That's what you did for me in Alcoholics Anonymous, and it took me a while to be able to read again, but you gave me a book, you told me what to read, and you told me how to think about it. You see how perfectly God knows what we need? That's why I went to college for 18 years. I do that real well. And then all of a sudden one day they gave me a terminal degree. Now, by now we are up to summer 1977. I have 4 years and some months of sobriety. I have worked the program to the best of my ability one day at a time. I have sat at Chuck's feet hour after hour and listened, as you always do when you sit at Chuck's feet. And I had shared the most spectacular sobriety. Southern California meetings are better than the movies. It's absolutely wonderful. You can be entertained 7 nights a week by the weirdest people you ever want to meet. They will tell you in endless detail and variety how they do it, and therefore you shouldn't do it that way. I loved Alcoholics Anonymous in Laguna Beach. I became totally involved in the program in this way of life. I completed my PhD, and in June of 1977 I was to graduate. And my graduation was scheduled for June 11th, and on June 9th, Tommy said, "Cindy, something's wrong. Something has changed. I'm moving out." I said, "You're what?" He said, "Yes, I'm going to move down the street for a while. I have some problems with the relationship that I need to work on." I said, "You're kidding. I hadn't even noticed anything was wrong, much less that it was that wrong." I was totally amazed, with the kind of amazement that I now know is not uncommon in Alcoholics Anonymous. Most things amaze me clear down to my toes, because what I work toward today is increasing awareness. And when you work on increasing awareness, watch out. You're going to get it. And things have amazed me to my toes so many times. And Tommy amazed me that day. I had no idea. So we moved down the street, and I got my degree. And he came to me a couple of weeks later, and he said, Cindy, I want a divorce. And I said, you what? He said, I want a divorce. Our relationship is ended. I said, it's not. It can't be. It's a perfect relationship. You've saved my... How can it be over? It can't be over. I'm not done yet. Of course, you know I was. I'm usually the last one to know when I'm done. A few days later, I was sitting with my friend Patty in the living room. Now, I'm a psychologist. I've got this big fancy degree, right? It says I'm a psychologist. I ought to be able to figure this guy out, and I'm going on with Patty about what might be happening, what kind of changes he's going through, and I wonder how long it'll take before he's back. And all of a sudden, I noticed the tears were pouring down her face. I said, Patty, what's wrong? She said, Cindy, don't you know? I said, no, what? She said, honey, Tommy's in love with another woman. I said, oh, it never occurred to me. I asked him, and he said no. He had to say no. Tommy was in love with another woman. I would like to tell you that I made it through that experience with a lot of dignity and grace. Not true. I cried for days, for weeks, for months. As I look back on that experience, I realize that Tommy did for me the greatest thing he could have ever done. He helped me find my sobriety, my strength, and my growth in the fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous. If you told me a month before that happened that I would go through that experience and not drink, I would not have believed you. If you had told me that day I wouldn't drink, I wouldn't have believed you. Somehow, some way, with Taylor's help and Bob's help, Tom's help, Chuck's help, I did not drink one day at a time. I have never experienced such agony. Humiliation. Oh, talk about humiliation. I was 35 years old. Tommy was 35 years old. He fell in love with a 20-year-old woman. You want to get in touch with all your wrinkles? You want to find out just how much you sagged in 15 years? Just let your husband fall in love with a woman 15 years younger than you are. Oh, it was an excruciating experience. Excruciating. And I went sniveling and whining up to Chuck's house, and I said, my God, Chuck, how can this happen? I've worked the program. I've worked with newcomers. I've done everything you told me, one day at a time to the best of my ability. And he looked at me and said, chuckle. He said, oh, you made a bargain with God, huh? I said, uh-oh. If I do this, then you'll do that, right? No. No. I do this because I do this. Period. A lot of people helped me through that summer. I spent a lot of time working on my degree with the typical paranoia of graduate students, knowing that I would have this wonderful degree, which, by the way, was going to change me. I knew for 18 years that if I ever got a PhD, I'd be okay. That I would then have the evidence on the wall that I'm okay. Guess what happened? It's just me with a PhD. I heard a doctor say it beautifully. He said, I suddenly realized in a moment of horrible clarity in Alcoholics Anonymous that all those degrees on the wall are not a sign of my success, they're a sign of my great fear of failure. Well, I had this sign of my great fear of failure on the wall, and I'd worried throughout that I was not going to get a job. It never occurred to me to worry about my marriage. In my mind, my marriage was made in heaven. God had provided Tommy to help me stay sober, work the program, and be a good girl. And for 4.5 years, I'd worked the program. I'd been absolutely faithful to one man for the first time in my whole life. I didn't even know that was an option. I didn't even know anybody'd ever want to. And all of a sudden I was. And it wasn't even anything I thought about or planned, or it just happened. I just did it. So, that is exactly how youthful worry has been in my life. I worried about not finding a job. 2 weeks after Tommy left, the phone rang and I was offered a job at the University of Arizona in Tucson. So, the thing I worried about didn't happen, and the thing I never thought to worry about happened. That's always the way it is. I always missed that mark. Arvidas reminded me that the definition of the word sin is from archery, and it means very simply to miss the mark. I have been and still am a sinner. I often miss the mark. That's how I learn my most important lessons. You all have taught me, by the way, how to be a better archer. Alcoholics Anonymous has taught me that to win, you shoot, and whatever you hit, you call it the target. So, I sin and then I sin no more. I remember to call whenever I hit the target. That's how I sin no more. So, Tommy and I were divorced. I packed all my love and laughter into cardboard boxes. I left California to go to Tucson. One day in my life in Alcoholics Anonymous, I was a happily married student living on the beach in California. The next day, I was a single professor living in the desert. I have no idea to this day what happened or why. It helped me realize that as a matter of fact, my life is none of my business. I show up every morning, I report for duty, and I go for it. I go in whatever direction I am pointed, and I have been pointed in some amazing directions. The desert is not, to say the least, my favorite place in the universe. I have learned a lot in the desert. I have learned to walk more slowly or I fall down. Especially now, it's hotter than the hinges of hell, and you don't just scurry around in the desert, you slow down. And after I lived in Tucson for about a year, I went back to Laguna. I make these journeys back to Laguna Beach where God vacations. And I went to see Chuck and I said, Chuck, I can't do it anymore. I go to meetings in Tucson. They don't want to hear what I have to say. They don't want to hear about laughing and having fun, and they certainly don't want to hear about the 13th step, and they don't want to hear what I believe today to be true, that there's no way to do it wrong, there's just doing it. They talk about doing it wrong, and I grind and cry and say, you can't do it wrong, you just do it. Even if you drink, it isn't wrong, because drinking will bring you back. It's perfect. He said, honey, in Laguna Beach, there are hundreds of Cindys. We don't need you here. Go back to the desert. There's just one Cindy there. So I went back to the desert. And I understand partially why I am where I am today. The job I was offered was teaching in a program called Addiction Studies. So we have a 2-year graduate program. One of my graduates is here today, and it's wonderful to see him. And we teach people how to work with people like me. Now, would you have thought when I started 40 minutes ago that 18 years of education and 15 years of alcoholism and drug addiction would ever come together to make so much sense? I never would have believed it. Today, I can look back on my life and realize that every day was absolutely essential. I could not do today without any single day of my life. I couldn't have shot any less dope. I couldn't have drank any less scotch. I couldn't have turned one last trick. Where else at Alcoholics Anonymous can you go from being a prostitute to being a professor in 4 painful, growing years? It can't be done. People don't do that unless they're a part of this fellowship. And we do it every day. It's no big deal. Last March of 1979, I was living in Tucson, teaching school, and I got a phone call at 6 o'clock one morning from my sister telling me that my 30-year-old brother had taken his life. I adore my brother. I always have and I always will. He was 8 years younger than I and my first baby. I immediately flew to Florida to be with my mother and father, as my sister did. And I don't know if you've ever made a flight like that, stone cold sober, where you know you're going to step off that plane and see two people you love the most in their agony and their loss and their grief. I love you, Ted. But I made that trip, and it was just as hard as I knew it was going to be. It was just as full of agony and grief. There isn't anything that I know of harder than seeing someone you love in pain. I have often been willing to take that pain away. Because of Alcoholics Anonymous, I cannot do so. God knows exactly what He's doing. It is none of my business. So I went to share my mother and father's loss. And the night after the funeral, my father was so drunk and so awful and so obnoxious, and I didn't know what to do. And we all sat together and we cried together and we wondered why together. Suicide is a cruel experience for those who are left behind. You always know there's something you could have said. You always know deep inside that if he'd just called, if he'd just given you a chance, you could have done it. But you're not given that chance because it's not any of my business. If my life is none of my business, my brother's life is none of my business. His life is and was as perfect as mine is. The morning after my brother's funeral, I picked up the phone and called Alcoholics Anonymous, and I said, I need help. My father needs you. I can't help him. I don't know what to say. I don't know how to help. Dad and I were great drinking buddies. We laughed and loved to drink together. He was very baffled by my sobriety, and he often said, if I'd gotten into those drugs, I'd probably need that too. You know how we are. There's always some exception or why we don't quite need it yet. Anyway, I picked up the phone and called Alcoholics Anonymous. The beautiful woman on the phone said, I'll call the right people. We'll get back to you. A couple of hours later, the phone rang and a man said, I'm on my way. Wednesday morning, 2 days after my brother's funeral, a man pulled up in the driveway of my father's home. Now, if I had ordered the man I wanted to 12-step my father, I wouldn't have done nearly as good a job. Because the man who pulled up in the driveway pulled up in a car more expensive than the one my father drives. He had a sticker on the window from a neighborhood that's fancier than the one my father lives in. He stepped out of the car with a better suntan than my father. Much trimmer, much fitter. He had under his arm the book Alcoholics Anonymous. He walked into my father's living room, and he did for my father what you had done for me in 1972. He brought him the message of Alcoholics Anonymous. And he put his arms around my dad, and he said, "You don't have to drink anymore." And my dad said, "Oh, thank God." And last March, my father celebrated his second anniversary in Alcoholics Anonymous. We have much more fun being sober together than we did drinking together. He loved it. That first night we all went to a meeting. Jim took us to a meeting. And we walked into the meeting and they thought I was the newcomer. My dad loves to talk at meetings. My father, I have always known, would love Alcoholics Anonymous the way I do. He loves to talk. He loves to share. He's been a salesman all his life, so he can remember your name from the time he hears it. He has these little devices for improving his memory. So he loves Alcoholics Anonymous, and he loves to talk about how his daughter got him sober. Now, I just told you how he got sober. I called Alcoholics Anonymous, and you all came. I didn't get him sober, but he thinks so. A lot of people think that way, and that's okay with me. He can think I did it as long as he wants to. Someday he'll understand who did it and how it happened. He's a magnificent man, and it has been proof in my life that every ending has within it a new beginning. I believe today that one dramatic function of my brother's death was my father's sobriety. My brother died so that my father could live. I don't understand why. I never will, and I don't have to. I mentioned earlier that I lost the right to raise my son in 1970. I had a daily prayer from that time until 1978. I prayed daily just to have the opportunity to share in my son's life. When I lost custody, he went to live with his father, and for a period of time I lost touch with him completely. For many years we talked on the phone every weekend. Those of you who have lost custody of your children know that when you see them periodically on weekends or during the summer, you get this sort of fantasy relationship going. And my son and I had a beauty going. We knew that if we could ever be together, everything was going to be okay. So I had a daily prayer. I would like to spend time with my son. I would like to share my son's life. So, one day in 1978, he stepped off a plane and walked into my life. He had made a decision at the age of 13 that he was going to come and live with his mother. I would like to say to you right now that if you have lost your children, even if you've lost the right to ever see them again, hold yourself in readiness. Someday, somewhere, they are liable to step off a plane, a train, or a bus and walk into your life and say, "Here I am." Now, I had prayed a daily prayer. He had been with me about 3 months. We had a little house in the desert in Tucson. I was teaching school. He was going to school. Everything was just as beautiful as we had thought it would be for about 3 months. All of a sudden, one day, the school called and said, "We haven't seen your son for a while. Is he sick?" And I said, "You what?" To make a long story very short, he decided that high school was stupid. If any of your teenagers have decided that, it's awfully hard to make a case for the opposite. One of my ruder awakenings, since I have become a part of the faculty of the university, is the discovery that one of the few things that does not take place regularly on a university campus is education. A lot of other things go on, but education is not often among them, unfortunately. So when my son said, "I will not go to school," I didn't have a lot of room to argue with him. Things went from bad to worse. because when my son drinks and uses drugs, he changes. And he became devoted to the use of drugs and alcohol. I learned that year the wisdom of the 11th step. I learned why we pray only for the knowledge of His will for us and the courage to carry that out. I know today why it took 7 years for me to get ready to live with my son. We had a remarkable time. Have you ever tried to tell somebody who's 17 years old anything? I forgot what it was like to know everything. I really did. He knows everything. And we've had a lot of ups and downs. I kicked him out, finally, for a year. Those of you who have had the opportunity to do that know what it's like. Now, add to that the fact that I lost the right to raise him, that for 7 years I was not a part of his life. Then he came to my life, this wonderful gift from God, and within 2 years I had to ask him to leave. Winnie said it beautifully. I had to allow him the dignity of failure. I could not protect him. You see, I can talk to you all morning about the importance of pain and how I have learned to use pain and let pain grow me. But my God, I don't want my baby to hurt. I don't want my son to know pain. If I could, I would remove from him every moment of hurt. But of course I can't. That's why it's set up the way it is. I cannot take away his opportunity for pain. And if I try, my life gets so painful that I can't stand it. So the day came when I had to say, my dear, I love you. You know I love you. And you must leave my home. You know the way I live. You are not willing to live that way. Therefore, you cannot live here. It has been among my greater surrenders. I have had many. I am grateful for all of them. I told you that my husband fell in love with another woman and left me. My son came to live with me. My brother passed away. Among all of my experiences in sobriety, there was one experience I had promised myself I would not have. I had promised myself for 7 years that I would not fool around with a married man. After all, I am now sober. I'm now an intelligent woman of, at that time, 39 years old. Of course, I created the necessity for the experience. When I said of that young woman, how could she? My God said, we're going to find out. Because last summer, at about this time, I fell in love with a married man. He subsequently quit his job, divorced his wife, and we now live together in Tucson. If you add up those years, you will notice that from 1977 to 1980 is 3 years. I lived for 3 years in the desert, and it's very strange looking back on it. When I left Laguna Beach, a friend of mine said, in 3 years, you will be ready for the next one. I said, 3 years? She said, you're going to have a lot of fun shopping. 3 years. There were times when they seemed endless. There were many times when I told myself that I blew it, that I had had my one chance at a true relationship. Somehow I failed. I didn't know how. Tommy had left, and I wasn't going to get another shot. I totally accepted my life as it was. I became willing to live alone, do what I had to do, fight regularly with my son, ask him to leave, teach school, do whatever. And of course, as soon as I became totally willing to live exactly the way I was living, it changed. You can always tell when you fully accepted something, that's when it changes. That's when all of a sudden, as has happened to me so often in Alcoholics Anonymous, you walk around the corner, the phone rings, something happens, and your whole life changes. And I met this man. We had worked together for a year. We just hadn't noticed what was going on, and all of a sudden, my buzzer went off. All of a sudden, we discovered that we were in love, and we have today a beautiful life in the desert. We have a 1-acre ranch that we purchased together. We are what they call co-owners with right of survivorship. That means that both of us own it totally. That's perfect for two alcoholics. We both own the house totally. I can never say, get out of my half. And we recently bought a little Toyota diesel Volkswagen truck. We decided that after all these days, money is just paper, and as long as they're willing to shuffle the paper through our account, we'll spend it. I'm of the same opinion as one of the other speakers. As long as I have checks, I must have money. And my life today is full of love and laughter. Several people who've talked this weekend have talked about the line in the book that shares with us the opportunity to be happy, joyous, and free, and to avoid then the deliberate manufacture of misery, to capitalize on our difficulties, to use them as a testimony to God. That's what I've tried to do with you this morning, is to share with you that pain can always grow me. Laughter is the most important ingredient of my life. No matter how hard it gets, somebody helps me laugh. The Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous has taught me to love myself when I am totally unlovable, to love as much as I can from wherever I am. When my life is real hard and I'm in real pain, what did I think it was I was supposed to love anyway? It's easy to love the good days. It's easy to work the steps when it's sailing along. But all of a sudden, I have gotten a number of opportunities to really work the steps. Today, I can say to you that my life is beautiful. I have stood at these podiums and sobbed for an hour because my life has been hard. The only important thing is that when you ask, I will come. Because when I asked so many years ago, you came. And as long as you ask, I'll do whatever I can to come, to be with you, to share with you what you have given me, life as I understand it in Alcoholics Anonymous. I'm sorry I have to leave this morning so quickly. I'm going to go catch my airplane, go back to the desert, to my beautiful life, laughing and playing in the sunshine. God, the sunshine. Oh. It's wonderful. I'll be there just as long as I'm there. I've discovered in AA that I do it just as long as I do it, and when I'm done, I don't do it anymore. Life is very simple. I'm glad you asked me to show up. I hope since you won't have a chance to hug me, you will hug each other. Have a beautiful morning. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cindy.